Chapter 43 of Nickleby by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Chapter 43. Officiates as a kind of gentleman usher in bringing various people together. The storm had long given place to a calm, the most profound, and the evening was pretty far advanced. Indeed, supper was over, and the process of digestion proceeding as favourably as, under the influence of complete tranquillity, cheerful conversation, and a moderate allowance of brandy and water, most wise men, conversant with the anatomy and functions of the human frame, will consider that it ought to have proceeded. When the three friends, or as one might say, both in a civil and religious sense, and with proper deference and regard to the holy state of matrimony, the two friends, Mr. and Mrs. Browdie counting as no more than one, were startled by the noise of loud and angry threatenings below stairs, which presently attained so high a pitch, and were conveyed besides in language so tiring, sanguinary, and ferocious, that it could hardly have been surpassed, if there had actually been a Saracen's head then present in the establishment, supported on the shoulders and surmounting the trunk of a real, live, furious, and most unappeasable Saracen. This turmoil, instead of quickly subsiding after the first outburst, as turmoils not unfrequently do, whether in taverns, legislative assemblies, or elsewhere, into a mere grumbling and growling squabble, increased every moment, and although the whole din appeared to be raised by but one pair of lungs, yet that one pair was of so powerful a quality, and repeated such words as scoundrel, rascal, insolent puppy, and a variety of expletives no less flattering to the party addressed, with such great relish and strength of tone, that a dozen voices raised in concert under any ordinary circumstances would have made far less uproar and created much smaller consternation. "Why, what's the matter?" said Nicholas, moving hastily towards the door. John Browdie was striding in the same direction when Mrs. Browdie turned pale, and leaning back in her chair requested him with a faint voice to take notice that if he ran into any danger it was her intention to fall into hysterics immediately, and that the consequences might be more serious than he thought for. John looked concerted by this intelligence, though there was a lurking grin on his face at the same time. But, being quite unable to keep out of the fray, he compromised the matter by tucking his wife's arm under his own, and thus accompanied, followed Nicholas downstairs with all speed. The passage outside the coffee-room door was the scene of disturbance, and here were congregated the coffee-room customers and waiters, together with 2 or 3 coachmen and helpers from the yard. These had hastily assembled round a young man who from his appearance might have been a year or 2 older than Nicholas, and who, besides having given utterance to the defiances just now described, seemed to have proceeded to even greater lengths in his indignation, inasmuch as his feet had no other covering than a pair of stockings, while a couple of slippers lay at no great distance from the head of a prostrate figure in an opposite corner, who bore the appearance of having been shot into his present retreat by means of a kick, and complimented by having the slippers flung about his ears afterwards. The coffee-room customers, and the waiters, and the coachmen, and the helpers, not to mention a barmaid who was looking on from behind an open sash window, seemed at that moment, if a spectator might judge from their winks, nods, and muttered exclamations, strongly disposed to take part against the young gentleman in the stockings. Observing this, and that the young gentleman was nearly of his own age, and had in nothing the appearance of an habitual brawler, Nicholas, impelled by such feelings as will influence young men sometimes, felt a very strong disposition to side with the weaker party, and so thrust himself at once into the centre of the group, and in a more emphatic tone, perhaps, than circumstances might seem to warrant, demanded what all that noise was about. "Hello," said one of the men from the yard. "This is somebody in disguise, this is." "Room for the eldest son of the Emperor of Russia, gentlemen," cried another voice. Disregarding these sallies, which were uncommonly well received, as sallies at the expense of the best-dressed young persons in a crowd usually are, Nicholas glanced carelessly round, and, addressing the young gentleman, who had by this time picked up his slippers and thrust his feet into them, repeated his inquiries with a courteous air. "A mere nothing," he replied. At this a murmur was raised by the lookers-on, and some of the boldest cried, "Oh, indeed, wasn't it, though? Nothing, eh? He called that nothing, did he? Lucky for him if he found it nothing." These and many other expressions of ironical disapprobation having been exhausted, 2 or 3 of the out-of-door fellows began to hustle Nicholas and the young gentleman who had made the noise, stumbling against them by accident and treading on their toes, and so forth. But, this being a round game, and one not necessarily limited to 3 or 4 players, was open to John Browdie too, who, bursting into the little crowd, to the great terror of his wife, and falling about in all directions, now to the right, now to the left, now forwards, now backwards, and accidentally driving his elbow through the hat of that tallest helper who had been particularly active, speedily caused the odds to wear a very different appearance. While more than one stout fellow limped away to a respectable distance, anathematizing with tears in his eyes the heavy tread and ponderous feet of the burly Yorkshireman. "Let me see him do it again," said he who had been kicked into the corner, rising as he spoke, apparently more from the fear of John Browdie's inadvertently treading upon him than from any desire to place himself on equal terms with his late adversary. "Let me see him do it again, that's all." "Let me hear you make those remarks again," said the young man, "and I'll knock that head of yours in among the wine-glasses behind you there." Here a waiter, who had been rubbing his hands in excessive enjoyment of the scene, so long as only the breaking of heads was in question, adjured the spectators with great earnestness to fetch the police, declaring that otherwise murder would surely be done, and that he was responsible for all the glass and china on the premises. "No one need trouble himself to stir," said the young gentleman. "I am going to remain in the house all night, and shall be found here in the morning if there is any assault to answer for." "What did you strike him for?" asked one of the bystanders. "Aye, what did you strike him for?" demanded the others. The unpopular gentleman looked coolly round, and addressing himself to Nicholas, said, "You inquired just now what was the matter here. The matter is simply this. Yonder person, who was drinking with a friend in the coffee-room when I took my seat there for half an hour before going to bed, for I have just come off a journey and preferred stopping here tonight to going home at this hour when I was not expected until tomorrow, chose to express himself in very disrespectful and insolently familiar terms of a young lady, whom I recognise from his description and other circumstances, and whom I have the honour to know. As he spoke loud enough to be overheard by the other guests who were present, I informed him most civilly that he was mistaken in his conjectures, which were of an offensive nature, and requested him to forbear. He did so for a little time, but as he chose to renew his conversation when leaving the room in a more offensive strain than before, I could not refrain from making after him and facilitating his departure by a kick, which reduced him to the posture in which you saw him just now. I am the best judge of my own affairs, I take it," said the young man, who had certainly not quite recovered from his recent heat. "If anybody here thinks proper to make this quarrel his own, I have not the smallest earthly objection, I do assure him." Of all possible courses of proceeding under the circumstances detailed, there was certainly not one which, in his then state of mind, could have appeared more laudable to Nicholas than this. There were not many subjects of dispute which at that moment could have come home to his own breast more powerfully, for, having the unknown uppermost in his thoughts, it naturally occurred to him that he would have done just the same if any audacious gossiper durst have presumed in his hearing to speak lightly of her. Influenced by these considerations, he espoused the young gentleman's quarrel with great warmth, protesting that he had done quite right, and that he respected him for it, which John Browdie, albeit not quite clear as to the merits, immediately protested too with not inferior vehemence. "Let him take care, that's all," said the defeated party, who was being rubbed down by a waiter after his recent fall on the dusty boards. "He don't knock me about for nothing, I can tell him that. A pretty state of things if a man isn't to admire a handsome girl without being beat to pieces for it." This reflection appeared to have great weight with the young lady in the bar, who, adjusting her cap as she spoke and glancing at the mirror, declared that it would be a very pretty state of things indeed, and that if people were to be punished for actions so innocent and natural as that, there would be more people to be knocked down than there would be people to knock them down, and that she wondered what the gentleman meant by it, that she did. "My dear girl," said the young gentleman in a low voice, advancing towards the sash-window. "Nonsense, sir," replied the young lady sharply, smiling though as she turned aside and biting her lip, whereat Mrs. Browdie, who was still standing on the stairs, glanced at her with disdain, and called to her husband to come away. "No, but listen to me," said the young man. "If admiration of a pretty face were criminal, I should be the most hopeless person alive, for I cannot resist one. It has a most extraordinary effect upon me, checks and controls me in the most furious and obstinate mood. You see what an effect